What's up, friends, and welcome to another episode of Elevate and Thrive. And if you've ever wondered about gluten or celiac disease, then this is the episode for you. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Angela Yeagley.
Hello, everyone.
And we have recently put out some content on gluten sensitivity and gluten testing, and it got a lot of response. There was a lot of questions. People had a lot of sharing. And so we thought we'd take an opportunity to sit down and fill in some of the blanks, some of the questions that people ask, and talk a little bit about celiac and talk just about gluten sensitivity.
So this is I would say, a top question that I get. And also, interestingly enough, I feel like it's also something that people don't quite believe in. And that sounds strange, but when people come in, I think because it's become such a popular topic that people almost think it's made up, like coming in and going, my friend can't have, lotion that has gluten in it, can't share the same pan that, has gluten in it. And I think it's ridiculous. And you kind of go, well, let's talk about how this all came about, right? Like, why is the gluten allergy like such a popular allergy for people to have? Like, it is, I think, right to question, but actually there are answers for that.
Yeah, let's get into it because it is, one of those things that makes you wonder, like, is it real? But, we've been asking that questions about aliens for a long time.
We know that too. The answer is yes.
The answer seems to be pointing towards a yes. So, well, I'm just going to say, suspend disbelief here. And if you are, currently dealing with a gluten sensitivity or even with a full diagnosis of celiac disease, then we're hopefully going to provide some insights into treatment options and ways that you can go about getting help and how we approach it here at Sage.
Right.
Maybe let's go back, though, like 10,000 years ago.
Exactly. Yes, that's where we need to begin. Strangely enough, 10,000 years ago. So that is the time that humans started to integrate basically agriculture into their food sources. And so that is when we started to cultivate grains at that time. And of course, as time went on, as the thousands of years, marched forward to getting close to this present time. Progress. Yeah.
Technological improvement.
Exactly. Yes. And so there became, a greater use. It became easier to mill flour. And so people used it more, right?
More mouths to feed. Processing allows, finite resource to become an almost infinite resource with a food because you can distill it down, repackage it, turn it into other stuff, put it on a shelf, put it in a box, ship it around the world, ship it across the country, whatever. And so that's kind of the rise of the modern food system.
Right. Exactly. And so we started seeing, what's interesting in the medical literature, they started seeing a reference to wheat belly, even back starting in the late 1800s, and then of course going on into the the 1900s, that documented cases of, they would call it grain belly or wheat belly. And so people like to think that a problem with gluten or wheat is this is a modern thing, and it's not. It's allergy or intolerance to this has been around for a long time, right?
Similar to, just like there are some people who are allergic or have an intolerance for dairy, ever since, same kind of deal, right? It's like,
Absolutely, yeah.
So you could make the argument, well, has some of that stuff picked up because of the prevalence of various, additives and food processing techniques in the end, and just environmental toxins, environmental stress that probably makes just allergens in general more common today as the body is really stressed more. Yeah, that all makes sense. And I'm sure that, if you want to really geek out on this, there's probably some really great documentaries on Netflix.
They're absolutely great. Yeah.
The whole thing. But suffice to say, we're now at the spot where a significant portion of the population deals with this, whether it's a celiac situation or whether it's a gluten sensitivity. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the difference between those, because I think when, people have questions about gluten, I think sometimes that is around the severity, and this idea of gluten intolerance or an allergy to gluten versus like celiac disease. Those are two different things.
They are two different things, yes. And what's interesting, one thing I want to point out that I wanted to see what was out there on this topic. So I'm looking around, and what I found really fascinating is that on the internets, basically when you search, can you be tested for a gluten allergy versus celiac? And a lot of the sites say no. So I really want to clarify that because that's not true, actually. And so the difference between when we're looking at a gluten intolerance, right, or a sensitivity compared to celiac, gluten intolerance is going to be a allergy reaction, and that can be something called IgG or IgA. And I won't get too much into that. Just know that those are things that can be tested. They're gliadin antibodies, IgG and IgA, and those can be positive in both celiac and in both gluten intolerance, right? So now what differentiates the two? You get this test back and you're like, wow, okay, I just did those antibodies, the gliadin antibodies, and I'm positive, right? Really, part of it's going to be how high are those, so there's going to be a set number. Now, a basic lab is going to say, hey, if you're over 15, say for instance, this is likely celiac, right? But what if you're 9? So in standard medicine, they'll say, oh, look, this is completely negative. You have no problem at all. You don't have celiac and there's nothing wrong with gluten, right? That's not true, right? So if you are showing a positive antibody, that means there is an issue. It might not be celiac, but it's a gluten intolerance of some sort, right? And it's more likely to be more severe the higher that number is. So now moving on into celiac. So say if I get something back and I'm like, well, that's a significant number. Maybe it's not above 15, or maybe it is, or maybe it's close. Depending on their symptoms, our next step to diagnose celiac, or at least start to get an idea if you might have it, is to look for these autoantibodies. I'll say them, even though people, obviously you need to talk to your doctor. They're tissue transglutaminase and they're endomysial antibodies. So if you're positive for those, the likelihood that you have celiac is high. We really need to go a step further. There's genetic testing, and it's called HLA. There are specific ones that you look at for celiac, and so that can be done through your normal lab. And so if those are positive, there's a strong likelihood, because it's like if one of those gene types are positive, it's like a 98%, not over a 98, it's like almost like 98.9% chance that the type of gluten allergy you have or antibodies is celiac, right? But really the gold standard, just want to say, this will be in standard medicine right now. The gold standard is you technically are not diagnosed with celiac until you have an intestinal biopsy. That shows that you are having an autoimmune reaction to the gluten. And that's the difference, essentially. So the difference between a gluten allergy and having celiac is that now somebody can have gluten and be extremely sick from it. Like they feel awful. And I know we're going to talk about symptoms related to that. And I mean, maybe feel like I'm going to die. Like this stuff is horrible. But then we do all the antibodies. We do the celiac testing, we do the genes, and everything's negative. And it's like, well, the likelihood, without you going and getting an intestinal biopsy, everything else is the likelihood. This is just intolerance. This isn't celiac, right? But they're like, I feel horrible. Yes, you can feel horrible.
This is the difference between, really, to boil it down, it's the difference between your body having a reaction versus your body having an autoimmune attack, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So if those antibodies are positive and you have those other markers, what's happening is when you have gluten, it's going a step further. It's actually creating severe damage in the lining of your intestine because of your immune system is trying to kill it.
Yeah, your immune system's going berserk and
right.
damaging your body.
And damaging your intestines, yeah.
So you mentioned some of the symptoms. This is always, and you also mentioned a ton of testing. And so just like anything, part of what we do here in our job is to play detective a little bit and to ask a series of questions and to use very specific testing to try and get to the root cause and the understanding of what's really happening, because it can be complicated. There can be sometimes multiple factors going in or multiple other situations that are showing up, and it makes it look like one thing when it's actually another. But generally speaking, when we look for symptoms, what are we looking for, or what a person be experiencing that might tell them, hey, you should come in and get this checked out?
Yeah. So what's really interesting, I mean, a lot of people like to think that it's gut. So it can be the gut. You can be experiencing bloating and loose stool and constipation and nausea and abdominal pain and sometimes vomiting. It could be any of those things, right? However, what's really interesting, once you've been on a food for long enough, many times the body starts adapting, right? And essentially it starts coming out in other ways. And so a lot of times when people first come in and I'm running a full panel on them and I'm like, has anybody ever just at least checked this on you? They have fatigue, they have headaches, they have all these other things. We're going to screen it and it's positive. A lot of times they're like, oh, my gut's, I'm pooping every day. It's not loose. I'm fine. And so how gluten is affecting them is they're exhausted. Their body aches. They have some weird rashes. They have mood issues. They have depression, anxiety. They have their nervous system is really tapped. So maybe they're starting to, because it causes B vitamin depletion, they're getting neuropathy or loss of feeling. I would say fatigue is a big one, that we use. Like, it's like, let's screen this if you're extremely tired. And it can even go as far as there's a lot of damage in the intestines. We can see anemia associated with it, usually B vitamin deficiency, but depending on the severity, there could be iron issues too. So
what you're saying is it really goes way, way beyond just the gut thing. That
absolutely.
A lot of times people maybe think of bloating, constipation, diarrhea, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it can show up in all of these other ways.
Well, and what's really fascinating? You would think somebody who's celiac is always going to have like
the worst of everything.
They're going to have the worst of everything. No, actually, that's not true. It's what's really fascinating. I have people who are celiac, have the worst antibodies. They have everything is positive, right? The genes are positive, everything. And I'm like, you absolutely, this is done. Like, there is no gluten for you. Like, there's no even, no sampling. Yeah, don't even look at the gluten. Like, they're the people that you got to read the labels on your lotions. They're the person who's like, all right, family, I've got my own, pan. Nobody can use it. Nobody can use this. And what's really fascinating, there are times when they don't really notice much of anything. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, how is that even possible?
Yeah, this just goes back to how unique and kind of just individual people's different experiences and whatnot. But these are at least some broad symptoms that you can be thinking of and questioning if you're wondering, hey, is this something I should look into? And so if you are questioning and you are thinking about looking into that, you mentioned a number of different testings and different like ways to start. Why don't we just real quickly walk through how it kind of works if you want to come in?
Yeah. So essentially we need to establish care, and then really we just need to start with some blood work. So I would just do those. It's all through blood. So gliadin antibodies, I would start with that. I mean, there's really no need.
Start with the basic.
Yeah. Unless somebody is like, their symptoms are so severe, like they're having a lot of gut symptoms that are that have been going on a long time and they're very severe. It's like, okay, we might decide to go ahead and just add on those celiac gene, the celiac panel. But starting with the gliadin antibodies that's really the easiest way to do it. The IgG, IgA, and it's a simple blood test and can be done just through Quest or LabCorp. Doesn't have to be specialty. It's easy, and you can request that from your primary too, just to say, I am having all these symptoms. I've now heard this podcast. I've been educated, please order these for me, and if, probably for your primary, if you've got some gut symptoms, that's going to help for the diagnosis. So.
Yeah. And if they laugh in your face or, kick you out of their office, come see us and we'll make sure we listen to your situation and ask the appropriate questions and really, of course, look to make sure that we do the right steps in the beginning to start to diagnose something that can a lot of times go undiagnosed because how the traditional or normal standardized testing looks at some of these values. So this is definitely something, if you've had the sneaking suspicion or you're wondering, and maybe you've been tested in the past and, it was inconclusive, this is something here that we specialize in. So it is worthwhile potentially to come in and talk about it some more.
Yeah, would love to. Yeah, please come in. And then once you have the diagnosis, of either the intolerance or the celiac, then we have a whole plan for you as well. Like, that's the next step on the protocol of gut healing, right? And then helping you understand all the things that gluten can be in and that you look to avoid. And usually we have people start with like elimination and challenge, right? So they're there. If you're just intolerant, there can be some flexibility there, just depending on how severe.
Totally. And that's where we work with you on a personalized plan and help you establish those parameters and those boundaries, as well as the just different nutritional support or the different vitamins, mineral support or therapies that we have here that we can deploy that can really help dial things in for you so that, you're in a spot where you're, it's the right spot. It's the sweet spot that is kind of for you. That might mean never having gluten again, or that might mean that there's a certain tolerance that you have. And if you go beyond a certain threshold with the right support, you have some of these situations, some of these issues come up. But if that you stay kind of in this, inner range or whatever, you don't really have many issues. And that's really comes down to you individually and working with you to figure that out.
Yeah, would love to see you. Yeah, if you have any of these concerns or questions, come on in. Let's do the testing. Would love to see you.
Absolutely. Number one, you are not alone. You have hope. There is help. We have ways we can get into this and help you find treatment. So don't suffer in silence. Come in and let's get this figured out.
Yes, love to see you.
All right. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Okay, bye.
Bye.